Can we talk about Ukraine?
Sure.
You have a disagreement with you with what Destiny said.
My main problem with Biden's policy with regard to Ukraine is that he outsourced the end goal of the war to Zelenskyy early on. Now, that might make sense if that goal were something that he was willing to fund to the point of achievement, or if Zelenskyy could have achieved it on his own. But right now, and this has been true since pretty early on in the war, this point Henry Kissinger made, that pretty early on in the war, it was very clear that, for example, Crimea was going nowhere. The Russians had control of Crimea, barring the United States giving permission to fly F-16s over Crimea. Nothing was going to change over there. The same thing was true in most of the Donbass, right, in Luhansk and Donetsk. That was not going to change. Zelensky's stated goal, and you understand it, he's the leader of Ukraine, right, is that there was a predation on his territory in 2014, and that the Russians sent their little green men across the border, and then they took all of these areas. And so he, as the leader of Ukraine, is saying, okay, I want all of that back. Now, the reality is that the U.S.'s interests had largely been achieved in the first few months of the war, meaning the revocation of the ability of Russia to take Ukraine and just ingest it, and two, the devastation of Russia's military capability. I mean, Russia has just been wrecked. I mean, their military is in serious straits because of the war in Ukraine. From an American perspective, I'm very much pro all of that. I think that we have an interest in Ukraine maintaining a buffer status against territorially aggressive Russia. I think that the United States does have an interest in degrading the Russian military to the extent that it can't threaten the Baltic states or threaten Kazakhstan or other countries in the region. The problem I have with Biden's strategy is, as always, I think that it's a muddle, and I think muddles tend to end with misperceptions. War tends to break out and maintain because of misperception. Misperception of the other side's strength, the other side's intentions, and all of the rest. People misperceive what's going to happen. They say, I'll cross that line and nothing will happen, right? This is what Putin thought. He thought, I'll cross that line, they'll greet me as a liberator, and because the United States just surrendered in Afghanistan, essentially, they won't do anything, and the West is fragmenting because NATO's fragmenting and all the rest of this, and obviously he was wrong on all of those scores. The problem for Biden is that, as with virtually every war, no end line was set. And so it became out recently, it was widely reported, that actually there was a peace deal that was on the table in the first few months that Putin was on board with, that basically would have ceded Luhansk and Donetsk and Crimea to Russia in return for solidification of those lines, American and Western security guarantees to Ukraine, right? Ukraine wouldn't formally join NATO, but there would be security guarantees to Ukraine. We're ending up there anyway. It's just taking a lot more money and a lot more time to get there.
And do you think Trump would have helped push that peace?
Yes. And I think that Biden actually did Zelenskyy a bit of a disservice, because Zelenskyy knows where this war is going to end, and it's not going to end with Luhansk and Donetsk and Crimea in Ukrainian hands. It's just not going to, and he knows that. What actually, in my opinion, Zelenskyy needed was for Joe Biden to be the person who foisted that deal upon him so that he could then go back to his own people and say, listen, guys, I wanted all those things, but the Americans weren't willing to allow me to have all those things. And so we did an amazing job. We did a heroic job in defending our own land. We devastated the Russian military, even though no one expected us to. But we can't get back those things because it's unrealistic to get back those things, because America, basically, they're a big funder and they're the ones who want the deal. Instead, what Biden said, and this was reported in the Washington Post last year, the Biden administration said, we're going to fight for as long as it takes with as much as it takes. And when they were asked until when, they said, whatever Zelenskyy says. And that's not a policy. That's just a recipe for a frozen conflict with endless funding. Now, it may be that Putin has walked away from the table and that deal is no longer available. If that deal is available right now, I certainly hope that's being pursued behind closed doors. My main critique, again, of Biden is that when you outsource the end goal to another country without stating what America's interest is, that's a problem. I also think that Biden did really quite a poor job of sort of explaining what America's realistic interests are. I don't like it when American leaders, it's weird for me to say this, but I'm not a huge fan of the we're in it to protect democracy kind of rhetoric, because frankly, we are allied with many, many countries that are not democracies, and that's not actually how foreign policy works. We should, as an overall, 30,000-foot goal, advance democracy and rights where we can. But the reason that we were fighting in favor of Ukraine, and when I say fighting, I mean giving them money and giving them weaponry, the reason that we were doing that in favor of Ukraine is not because of Ukraine's long history of clean voting and non-corruption. The reason that we were doing that is to counter Russian interests in the region. I mean, it was a pure realpolitik play. And that realpolitik play is hard to deny no matter what side of the aisle you're on. I think that what many Americans are reverting to is we have no interest there. why are we spending money there and not spending money here, and that kind of stuff. And that argument can always be applied unless you actually articulate the reason why it is good for Americans beyond simply the ideological for the United States to be involved in a thing. So, for example, I think right now, when Biden is talking, I think that what Biden just did, the United States, as we speak, is striking the Houthis. I think that that's a really, really good thing. I think that's a necessary thing. I think American people should understand why that is happening. It's not because of quote unquote ideology. Mm-hmm. It is, I mean, on a very root level, but really it's because you're screwing up the straits. I mean, you can't do that. You can't screw up free trade. And Americans have an interest in not seeing all of our prices at the grocery store double and triple because a bunch of ragtag pirates, akin to the Barbary pirates from 1800, are bothering everyone, right?
So Ben said a lot there. Do you disagree with any aspect on the Ukraine side?
A little bit, yeah. I think on the macro, I agree. Maybe we get into the weeds a little bit on some things. On the final thing that he said, though, I wish that Americans could have honest conversations about foreign policy. I think that it would just be better for everybody. I don't know if it's, Red Scare after the Cold War, where it was like literally, the behemoths, we're fighting against communism. And we felt like after 91, every single foreign policy decision needs to be able to be explained in like 7 words, like he's the bad guy and that's it. I wish we had more honest conversations about what our foreign policy interest is in a particular region, because I don't think most Americans honestly could even articulate why Israel would be an important ally, or why it's important to defend Ukraine against Russia, or why should we care about Taiwan at all. I don't know if most Americans could articulate anything there, even though they might have very strong opinions about why we ought to be involved in certain conflicts. So I do agree with that. I wish we had more honest conversations about foreign policy. In terms of how Biden has handled Ukraine, the things that I liked the most were, one, that he was very clear in the beginning about what we wouldn't do. So Biden saying that we're not going to do not a red line, no-fly zones over Ukraine. Mm-hmm. We're not going to be deploying troops on the ground in Ukraine. We're not going to be doing anything that would have, U.S. soldiers and Russian soldiers crossing swords with each other. That's not going to happen. I like that he made that very clear at the beginning. And I like that he coalition built between NATO and the EU to get people to send funds, training, soldiers, airplanes, and everything to Ukraine. I thought those 2 things were really good. In terms of basically writing Zelenskyy a blank check, I would like to hope that Biden and the entire United States learned a lesson from Iraq and Afghanistan, that open-ended missions with unlimited budgets and no clear goal are like the worst foreign policy decisions you can ever do. They've defined U.S. foreign policy for the past 2 or 3 decades, which is unfortunate, but seems to be the case. My feeling would be, and this is just a feeling, I don't know if internal cables have leaked that say otherwise, is the Biden administration has probably always had a quiet position of, at some point there's going to be an off-ramp here. And I think even a month or 2 ago, I think those talks were being leaked, that discussion had begun with Zelenskyy looking for an off-ramp. But publicly, of course, the United States is never going to come out and say, we are going to support you guys to fight as much as you want for 3 months. And then after that, it's no more. Obviously, that can't be the statement. It's always going to be that we're going to support you in your fight against Russia.
Yeah, we tried that under Obama with Afghanistan. It was terrible.
Sure. Yeah, you can't.
We'll escalate the troop levels to X, but only for 6 months, and then we're
You just can't do that. It's always going to come off as, we're going to support you forever, and as long as it takes, and as long as you need, whatever we have to do to defend freedom and democracy in your country. And any other statement would be absurd. So I can understand why it feels like, on a public level, a blank check and an indefinite time period was granted to Zelenskyy, but I don't think that's going to be the case. I think I hope we've learned our lessons in the Middle East about the forever wars, that this isn't going to be a forever funding to Ukraine to fight for as long as they want. I do disagree. I feel like we're playing a little bit retrospectively, saying that it's obvious that they're not going to capture the Donbass. It's obvious that they're not going to capture Crimea. I agree, for Crimea, that was incredibly obvious. But it was also really obvious that in 2 weeks, Russia would own Kiev and Ukraine was going to be Belarus 2.0. I think that even for a lot of military people, and analysts around the world, that was an expectation, or at least a significant probability. Nobody knew, the phrase that's thrown around now is paper tiger, that Russia's military was as ill-equipped as they were. So I can understand why, especially if you're Ukraine and if you've repelled an invasion from one of the world's largest armies, why you might feel like, well, fuck it, let's fight for a few months, let's fight for a year, let's see what happens. And I can understand the United States supporting them, but I agree that there has to be some reasonable off-ramp where we're not going to fight forever. I think the U.S. State Department has already begun those conversations with Zelenskyy to look at what that off-ramp looks like. But yeah, I'm not too sure, other than explicitly stating publicly, you can only fight until this date. I don't really know what else I would change. I don't think the Biden administration should have done that. I don't know what else.
Do you think Biden should cut this deal on the funding? Meaning there's there's this $105 billion deal that's been held up by debate between Republicans and Democrats, over border, right? So basically, it contains $60 billion for Ukraine, $14 billion for Israel, another several billion dollars for Taiwanese defense against China, and then it includes some border funding and some border provisions. Republicans want the border funding and the border provisions because we can get into the illegal immigration issue, but that's a pretty serious issue. And Biden and Democrats have been unwilling to hold that up. And that seems to me like, just from put aside Republicans, Democrats, it seems like political malpractice, meaning there's a widespread perception in the United States that the border is a disaster area. Joe Biden wants these things. Many Republicans don't want these things. If he caves on the border stuff, he gets all the things that he wants, and he's going to be able to go back to the moderates in the country and say, I did something about the border. It seems like such an obvious win.
If he caves on the border stuff, you mean on the Ukraine stuff?
Yes, because then he gets the whole package.
Sure,
Meaning he can go back to his own base and he can say, listen, guys, I wanted to be easy on the border. The Republicans forced me to it, but we needed the Ukraine aid. We needed the Taiwan aid, right?
Yeah.
Like that's
you're going to be more educated than me on this. I don't like, or maybe I just don't know enough. I don't like the principle that when we negotiate things in the United States, there's like 50 million hostages at all points in time for every single thing. Like, oh boy, here comes the debt ceiling. What do the Republicans want? What do the Democrats want? Oh boy, like here, we can't fund our government. But I mean, obviously, the argument is going to be that if the Ukraine funding doesn't come in this bill, and if Biden and his administration feel like it's really important, that not unilaterally, but as a single issue, it's not going to pass. So I would say that at this point, and I don't know what the conversations look like between the Biden administration and Zelenskyy, I would say at this point that it's probably fair to start making contingencies on the money that we give to Ukraine, that listen, like this conflict has, waged on now. Like now we need to start looking for potential peace. We can't just write you an unlimited check. So, I mean, if those strings are attached, I'd be okay with it. But the broader question of like, is it okay to make this particular piece of legislation with all this funding contingent on the Ukrainian funding? I mean, that just seems to be the way the government works now, unfortunately.